In a world torn by crusades and kingdoms, one man rose, not with rage, but with reason. He built an empire, but never lost his faith. He won battles, but cherished peace. This is the quiet story of Saladin, the Muslim king who faced the Crusaders calmly. Let the wars fade into whispers, as we explore his life, one quiet moment at a time. In a time of swords and sand, of kingdoms and crusades, a boy was born who would one day shape history, not with cruelty or chaos, but with clarity and calm. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. But the world would come to know him by another name: Saladin. He was not born into a throne, not wrapped in silk. His birth was quiet. In the year 1137, or perhaps 1138, in the city of Tikrit, by the banks of the Tigris River, in modern-day Iraq. His father, Ayyub, was an officer in service to the Seljuk Empire. His family was Kurdish, proud, but not powerful. The city they lived in was not theirs for long. Political conflict forced the family to flee Tikrit on the very night Saladin was born. As if fate knew that this child would never walk a smooth road. They journeyed to Mosul, then to Damascus, part of the great region known as the Levant. It was a land of ancient cities, winding deserts, and 1,000 claims to power. The Islamic world, at that time, was fractured. Caliphates struggled against empires. Governors defied sultans. Sunni and Shia debated. Warriors, scholars, traders, and pilgrims all moved under the same sun, but not always in the same direction. And to the west, across the sea and the sands, came the Crusaders. Knights from Europe, armored and devout, driven by the Pope's call to seize the Holy Land. They marched south, across the Balkans, through Byzantium, and into Palestine. They took Jerusalem. They built castles. They stayed. This was the world young Saladin grew up in. Not one of fairy tales, but one of borders and battles. Of cities reclaimed and cities lost again. As a boy, Saladin was quiet. Not the loudest. Not the strongest. But observant. He studied the Quran. Read poetry. Learned the ways of administration and command. He trained with the sword, yes, but his greatest weapon would always be his mind. He entered service under his uncle, Shirkuh, a general loyal to the Zengid dynasty of Mosul. It was this uncle who brought Saladin into Egypt, a land ancient, rich, and politically tangled. Egypt at the time was under the rule of the Fatimids, a Shia caliphate at odds with the Sunni powers in Damascus. But the Fatimids were weakening. Their court was divided. And both Crusaders and Sunni leaders saw opportunity. Shirkuh, along with Saladin, entered Egypt as part of a campaign to stabilize the region and counter Crusader influence. And then, fate made its quiet move. Shirkuh died unexpectedly in 1169. And the young, relatively unknown Saladin was named vizier, the highest position in Egypt's government. He was still in his early 30s. Surrounded by rivals. In a land not his own. Leading a government that followed a different sect of Islam than he did. But he moved with care. He did not rush. He strengthened alliances. Stabilized the treasury. Restored order. Gradually, he replaced Fatimid loyalists with men he trusted. And all without bloodshed. 2 years later, the Fatimid caliph died. And with his death, the Fatimid dynasty ended. Saladin declared allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate. Egypt, after 2 centuries, was now under Sunni rule once again. But Saladin was not just a servant. Not just a vizier. He was becoming something else. A symbol. A hope. A leader. In time, he would be Sultan. Of Egypt. Of Syria. Of Yemen. Of Mecca and Medina. Of Jerusalem. But first, he would have to face the storm rising from the west. The Crusaders. They had ruled parts of the Holy Land for nearly a century. They built towering castles, at Carrick, at Croc de Chevaliers, at Acre. They believed the land was theirs by divine right. They believed Saladin would be another in a long line of regional rulers, easily pushed aside. They were wrong. But Saladin was not quick to war. Not thirsty for battle. He understood that war drained cities. It emptied treasuries. It cost lives. Before he marched, he governed. He built hospitals. Funded schools. Hired scholars. Improved irrigation. Fed the poor. To his people, he was not just a warrior. He was order in a time of chaos. A quiet center in a swirling storm. Still, he prepared. Trained armies. Built alliances. Watched the Crusaders. Waited. And when the time came, he moved. In the year 1177, he marched into Palestine, seeking to test the strength of the Crusader kingdoms. He faced setbacks. He learned from them. He studied his enemies, not just their formations, but their hearts. He learned which lords sought glory. Which ones sought peace. Which ones could be reasoned with, and which ones could not. He was not a tyrant. He was not reckless. His campaigns were calculated. Focused. And through it all, he held to a principle rarely seen in war. Mercy. Saladin was devout. Not just in ritual, but in character. When he captured towns, he forbade looting. When he took prisoners, he treated them with dignity. When he faced defeated knights, he often freed them. This was not strategy. This was belief. In Islam, he saw not just a faith, but a guide. A compass. He prayed daily. Fasted. Gave charity. And governed with justice. Even his enemies noticed. The Crusaders began to fear his army, yes, but they also began to respect the men. Saladin. The name echoed across deserts. Across mountains. Across seas. A warrior. A scholar. A king. And his story, calm and strong, was only just beginning. Part 2, The Path to Power. Saladin unites the Muslim world. Saladin did not chase power for its own sake. He did not wear gold crowns. He did not build palaces to boast. His rise was quiet, methodical, and sometimes reluctant. But step by step, he became the most powerful Muslim ruler of his time. After establishing firm control over Egypt, Saladin turned his eyes north, toward Syria. At the time, the region was fractured. Cities like Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus were governed by different rulers. Many feared Saladin's growing strength. Some opposed him. Others supported him from a distance. He moved carefully. Diplomatically. But always forward. When the ruler of Damascus died in 1174, Saladin seized the moment. He entered the city not by force, but by invitation. The people welcomed him. The guards did not resist. Damascus, the heart of Syria, accepted him as its leader. From there, Saladin continued to build alliances and bring cities under his rule. Homs, Hama, Baalbek. Eventually, even Aleppo, the proud northern stronghold, came under his banner. But not all accepted him willingly. Some Muslim leaders accused him of ambition, of breaking with tradition, of being too powerful. Yet Saladin remained focused. His goal was not personal empire. It was unity. Because only a united front could stand against the Crusaders, who still held Jerusalem and much of the Levant. He believed deeply in jihad, not in the modern sense of conquest or terrorism, but in its historical meaning, struggle. A just, defensive effort to protect the Muslim world and sacred lands from invaders. Saladin didn't rush into war. He continued to govern, to organize, and to wait for the right moment. In the background, the Crusader kingdoms remained powerful but fragile. Their rulers squabbled. Some sought treaties with Saladin. Others plotted war. In 1183, Saladin launched a major campaign into Crusader territory, not to conquer cities, but to test their defenses. To show his strength. His army moved like a wave, thousands of men, disciplined, devout, and confident. They struck into Galilee, besieged cities, and returned home safely. It was not yet time for the final blow, but it was coming. Meanwhile, Saladin's reputation grew. He was not just a military leader. He was a symbol. To the Muslim world, he represented unity, honor, and justice. To the Crusaders, he was both feared and admired. Even Christian chroniclers, who rarely praised Muslim rulers, described him as noble, fair, and wise. He treated Christian prisoners with mercy, sent physicians to care for wounded enemies, released women and children without ransom. His actions baffled some and inspired others. Saladin believed in faith above fury, in discipline above destruction. Even as his armies grew and victories multiplied, he remained humble. He prayed regularly, slept on mats, not cushions, wore plain clothing, shared food with his men. He spoke softly, moved patiently, and led by example. He was not perfect. He made mistakes. At times, he acted with force when patience failed. He faced rebellions, betrayals, illness. But he did not stray from his path. He believed the Holy Land could not remain divided. He believed Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam, could not stay in Crusader hands. And so he prepared. For years, quietly, carefully. Until finally, the spark came. In 1187, a Crusader lord named Raynald of Chatillon broke a truce. He attacked a Muslim caravan, filled with merchants and pilgrims, under Saladin's protection. Saladin sent warnings, demanded justice. But Raynald refused. This was not politics. This was personal. Saladin gathered his forces. He sent messages across the region, to Cairo, Damascus, Mosul. He summoned warriors, volunteers, scholars, and clerics. Not to destroy, but to reclaim. That summer, his army marched. Not in chaos, but in silence and purpose. Tents were raised beneath olive trees. Banners fluttered in desert winds. Horses drank from cool wells. Archers sharpened arrows in the shade. The Crusaders met them at a hill near the Sea of Galilee. The place would be remembered forever. The horns of Hattin. The battle began at dawn. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Jerusalem and Raynald himself, had marched in the heat, thirsty and tired. They expected a quick engagement. Instead, they found fire. Saladin's men set dry grass ablaze, surrounding the Crusaders in smoke and heat. The sun beat down. The wind blew dust into eyes. Thirst grew unbearable. Saladin's cavalry struck with precision. Arrows flew. Swords clashed. By nightfall, the Crusader army was broken. Thousands were captured. Many more were slain. Among the prisoners were King Guy and Reynald. Saladin offered water to King Guy, as a sign of respect. But Reynald. Saladin faced him personally. Reminded him of his crimes. Of the oath he broke. Of the innocents he killed. And then, with a calm hand, Saladin executed him. Not with anger, but with justice. The rest of the prisoners were treated with dignity. Many were released. The wounded were cared for. Saladin's victory was total, but not cruel. It sent shockwaves across Europe and the Middle East. The road to Jerusalem was now open. But Saladin did not march blindly. He paused. Rested his men. Offered terms to cities along the way. Many surrendered peacefully. And so reclaiming Jerusalem as their divine mission. Saladin knew what was coming. He didn't panic. He fortified cities. Gathered supplies. Rebuilt walls. Strengthened alliances. But he did not strike first. He waited. Frederick Barbarossa died before reaching the Holy Land, drowned in a river in Anatolia. But the other two kings arrived by sea, landing in Acre. The siege of Acre became one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Crusades. Saladin's forces defended the city with resilience. But the Crusaders had numbers, siege machines, and supplies brought from Europe. The battle dragged on for nearly 2 years. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion consumed both sides. Finally, in 1191, Acre fell. Saladin was disappointed, but not defeated. He pulled his forces back, preserved his strength, and avoided a full-scale battle. He knew the Crusaders were not united. Tensions brewed between Richard and Philip. Trust was thin. Rivalries ran deep. When Philip returned to France, Richard remained. And with him began one of the most fascinating rivalries in history. Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin. They never met face to face. But their war was unlike any other. Richard was bold, brave, and aggressive. A skilled fighter and a charismatic leader. He led his men in battle, sword in hand, his golden lion standard flying. Saladin, by contrast, was steady, cautious, and wise. He avoided rash attacks. He preferred defense. Patience was his strategy. In 1191, Richard marched south along the coast. Saladin followed, striking from the shadows, harassing his supply lines, testing his army. The two clashed at Arsuf. There, Richard led a successful charge, breaking Saladin's lines. But Saladin retreated in good order. His army survived. His position remained strong. The war continued. Back and forth they moved, through plains, mountains, and valleys. Villages were captured. Then recaptured. But Jerusalem remained untouched. Richard approached the city. But he never attacked. He knew taking Jerusalem would be hard. Holding it would be harder. Saladin fortified the city. But he did not provoke battle. He waited, letting time and distance wear his enemy down. And slowly, it worked. Richard's supplies thinned. His men grew weary. Back in England, political troubles demanded his return. Neither side had won. But neither had lost. And so, in 1192, after months of campaigns, Saladin and Richard agreed to a truce. The terms were simple. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims could visit freely. Coastal Crusader cities would remain in Christian hands. The war would pause. It was not a perfect peace. But it was a wise one. Saladin honored the agreement. Even after Richard sailed away, he kept his word. And in the eyes of the world, Saladin stood tall, not just as a warrior, but as a man of honor. In truth, the war had taken its toll. Saladin had spent years in the field. He was aging. He had little interest in conquest now. He focused on rebuilding. On feeding the hungry. On restoring schools and mosques. His court was modest. He gave generously to the poor. Sold his own belongings to pay his soldiers. When he died in 1193, in Damascus, it was said that his treasury was nearly empty. He left behind no gold. No palaces. Northwest luxurious estate. Just a legacy. He was buried not in a grand tomb, but in a simple grave. Beside it, a message carved in stone. What we take with us is not what we leave behind in gold, but in honor. Even after his death, his name carried weight. In the West, he was respected, almost admired. Richard the Lionheart once said that if he were to lose his kingdom, he would wish it to be to no one but Saladin. In the East, he became a symbol of righteousness. A model of just leadership. His story passed through generations, not in songs of violence, but in tales of dignity. He was a leader who ruled with faith, fought with restraint, and died with humility. Saladin. The Quiet Conqueror. Part 4, Life in the Time of Saladin, a peaceful glimpse into the 12th century Islamic world. While history often remembers kings and battles, the world around them, the daily life of people, the rhythm of cities, the quiet beauty of knowledge and faith, is what truly shaped the age. During Saladin's time, the Islamic world was vast. It stretched from the mountains of Persia to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the sands of North Africa to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. This world was not only defined by its armies, but also by its culture. Let us now slow down. Step away from the noise of war. And walk quietly through the world Saladin lived in. It was a world of markets and mosques, of scholars and stargazers, of fountains, falcons, and flowing robes. A world where time moved with the sun, and life flowed like the slow turning of a water wheel. In the great cities of the Islamic world, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, life was vibrant, yet orderly. Mornings began with the call to prayer, echoing from the minarets. Shops opened. Bread was baked in clay ovens. Vendors arranged fruits and spices along the streets. The air filled with the smell of mint, cinnamon, and warm dates. People dressed in long robes called jubba or a thob, made of linen or wool, depending on the season. Scholars wrapped turbans around their heads, and women wore veils in many styles, though the customs varied from region to region. Cities were alive, but peaceful. Courtyards had fountains. Walls were painted with floral patterns or verses from the Quran. Children ran between stone columns, laughing and chasing cats. Scribes dipped reeds in ink and copied manuscripts by candlelight. In Cairo, the heart of Saladin's rule, the streets wound between tall, narrow buildings. Water carriers walked with leather pouches. Storytellers gathered crowds in the evening, reciting tales of heroes and travelers from long ago. Markets were more than places to buy and sell. They were centers of conversation. A man buying figs might discuss politics. A woman purchasing silk might speak of a sermon she heard the night before. News traveled quickly, carried by merchants, messengers, and sometimes, travelers returning from distant lands. And all around, there was learning. The Islamic world in the 12th century was a center of knowledge. Even in times of war, libraries continued to grow. Scholars studied ancient Greek texts, translated into Arabic centuries earlier. They preserved knowledge, improved it, and shared it across languages and borders. In medicine, figures like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, had already written great medical encyclopedias. Doctors in Saladin's time studied these works. They knew about surgeries, infections, and anatomy. They used tools made of silver and steel. Hospitals, called bimaristans, existed in most large cities. They treated patients regardless of wealth or faith. Science flourished. Astronomers observed the stars. They built astrolabes, devices to measure time, navigate, and determine the direction of prayer. Mathematicians solved equations and built upon the works of Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra. Engineers designed water systems, windmills, and intricate clocks. And poets wove words into verse. In Damascus, a young student might study the works of Al-Mutanabi. In Baghdad, another might read Omar Khayyam's quatrains. Poetry was not just art, it was memory, history, and emotion written in rhythm. Calligraphy was held in the highest regard. The written word, especially the Quran, was sacred. Scribes practiced for years to perfect the flowing Arabic script. Their hands moved slowly, with care and reverence. Books were copied by hand. Pages were bound in leather. Some libraries had hundreds, even thousands of volumes. And all of this existed quietly. Behind the veil of war and politics, the Islamic world in Saladin's time was a world of thought. Daily life varied by region, but there were common threads. People prayed 5 times a day. Mosques were central, not only for worship, but for teaching and community. Meals were simple, yet rich in flavor. Flatbread with olive oil. Lentils stewed with herbs. Roasted lamb or goat, seasoned with cumin, coriander, and cloves. Rice, dried fruits, and yogurt were staples. Families gathered on woven mats. They ate with their hands, from shared bowls. Hospitality was important. A guest was considered a gift from God. Homes were often built around courtyards. Gardens grew pomegranate trees, basil, and jasmine. In the evening, lanterns lit the walkways. Stories were told. Verses were recited. Tea brewed on small stoves. In villages, life was quieter still. Farmers tilled the land. Shepherds led goats along hillside paths. Children fetched water from wells. People rose with the sun and slept early. Seasons shaped their days, sowing in spring, harvesting in fall, praying for rain in summer. Festivals brought joy. During Ramadan, cities lit up at night. Drums woke people for suhoor, the pre-dawn meal. At Eid, sweets were shared, new clothes were worn, and families visited one another. And all across the land, people lived with rhythm and faith. Even amid conflict, there was diversity. Christians and Jews lived within Muslim lands. Many served as doctors, merchants, and officials. In Saladin's Cairo and Damascus, synagogues and churches stood alongside mosques. There were tensions, of course. Disagreements, rivalries, moments of injustice. But there was also coexistence. In fact, many Christian communities in Muslim lands preferred Saladin's rule to that of the Crusaders, who had, in many cases, been more brutal to non-Catholics and Eastern Christians. Saladin did not force conversion. His rule was defined by law, not by vengeance. This tolerance, rare for its time, became part of his legacy. One of the most remarkable aspects of the 12th century Islamic world was its connection. Trade routes linked cities. From the Silk Road to the Red Sea, merchants carried goods and ideas. From China came silk and porcelain. From India, spices and sugar. From Africa, gold and ivory. From Europe, wool and glass. But more than goods, they brought stories. An Uzbek merchant might meet a scholar from Andalusia in the alleys of Damascus. A Turkish soldier might hear tales of Africa from a Nubian trader. These exchanges created a fabric of civilization. Not uniform, but rich, diverse, and layered. It was in this world that Saladin rose, not as a lone warrior, but as part of a larger society. A society with depth, wisdom, and patience. A society that valued learning as much as loyalty. And faith as much as force. So now, as we reflect not on battles, but on life. Imagine the quiet streets of Damascus at dawn. The scent of cardamom in the air. A young boy walking to the mosque with his father. A merchant lighting a lantern in his shop. A calligrapher sharpening his pen. A healer preparing herbs. A mother pouring water for her child. And far off in a modest palace, a ruler sits not on a golden throne, but on a mat, reading from a book, listening to the morning breeze. That ruler was Saladin. But around him were thousands of others, quiet, faithful, and kind, whose lives shaped the age as much as any king. Part 5, The Legacy of Saladin, a life remembered in peace. Saladin had fought wars. He had won battles. He had conquered cities. But what he left behind was not destruction. It was memory. A memory that spanned both east and west. One that crossed deserts and mountains. One that whispered not of power or victory, but of dignity. After his death in 1193, the world paused. In Damascus, the streets grew quiet. Flags hung low. Soldiers bowed their heads. Scholars gathered to remember a man who had ruled, but never ruled harshly. In Cairo, candles were lit in his honor. In Jerusalem, prayers were said. In Europe, his former enemies wrote about him. Not with hate, but with awe. Even Crusaders, who had once fought against him on the battlefield, spoke of his character with respect. Knights wrote of his generosity. Clerics marveled at his mercy. One of the most famous European chroniclers of the Crusades, Baha ad-Din, who had served Saladin personally, recorded story after story, not just of his strategy, but of his soul. He told of how Saladin, even in the midst of war, would pause for prayer. How he would send his own doctor to treat wounded Crusader captives. How he forgave those who betrayed him, simply to avoid more bloodshed. And how, near the end of his life, he gave away all he owned to the poor. His grave in Damascus remains to this day. Simple. Humble. Beside the great Umayyad Mosque, it is marked by a small structure and a plain stone. Later rulers offered to build a grand tomb. Some did. But the original remains there, modest and calm. Visitors still come. Some Muslim. Some Christian. Some simply curious. They look upon the resting place of a man who could have ruled as a tyrant, but chose not to. A man who had every opportunity to take revenge, but instead offered peace. Saladin's legacy is more than his victories. It's in how he won. After Saladin's death, his empire did not last long in its unified form. His sons and relatives ruled different regions: Egypt, Syria, parts of Iraq. But without his guiding hand, rivalries returned. Still, the foundation he had built remained strong. His model of leadership influenced later dynasties. His approach to governance, balancing justice, piety, and tolerance, became an example for generations. Even centuries later, Muslim leaders invoked his name. Not for war, but for unity, for dignity, for justice. In the West, Saladin became a rare figure in medieval memory. Most Muslim rulers were depicted as enemies, villains, or threats. But Saladin stood apart. In poems and romances, European writers described him as chivalrous, as noble, as the ideal enemy. He became a character in stories, sometimes fictional, often dramatized, but usually respected. In Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the 14th century, Saladin appears in the first circle of hell, not as a sinner, but among the virtuous non-Christians, alongside philosophers and poets. It was a place for those who lived with honor, though they had not known Christian faith. In modern times, Saladin's image has endured. In the Arab world, he remains a symbol of leadership and resistance. His statue stands in front of the citadel of Damascus. His story is taught in schools. In the West, historians still write about him. Novels retell his life. Films reimagine his character. Sometimes romanticized. Sometimes misunderstood. But always remembered. What made Saladin's legacy so strong? Perhaps it was his faith. He was deeply religious, not in appearance, but in action. He prayed not for show, but for purpose. He governed by the principles of the Quran. He spoke gently, acted fairly, and forgave often. Perhaps it was his restraint. Even when he held all the cards, after Jerusalem, after Hattin, he did not humiliate his enemies. He sought treaties before battles, truces before sieges. He knew that real strength lay not in destruction, but in control. Or perhaps it was simply the timing. In a world of constant conflict, he stood out, not as the loudest, but as the calmest. Not as the fiercest, but as the fairest. He brought unity where there was division. He inspired respect where there was fear. And he died not as a conqueror, but as a man of the people. History remembers many figures. Some are feared. Some are forgotten. But a rare few are remembered with love. Saladin is among them. His story does not rise and fall with empires. It rests quietly in the memories of both friend and foe. In the pages of both Muslim and Christian history. And in the quiet hours of night, when wars fade into whispers, and kingdoms into dust, his story remains. Peaceful, powerful, and calm. Saladin. The man who ruled like a servant, fought like a believer, and passed like a legend. His victories were not measured only by land, but by the dignity he showed in defeat. His greatest moment may not have been a battle, but the moment he walked into Jerusalem, not to destroy, but to preserve. He let churches remain. He opened roads for pilgrims. He protected families who once feared him. And when he died, there were no gold-plated halls or mountains of treasure. He had given it all away. to orphans, to the poor, to those whose names history does not remember. But we remember him. Not because he shouted louder than others, but because his quiet example still echoes. In schools and books. In cities he once ruled. And in the hearts of those who value justice, even when no one is watching. Now, as your eyes grow heavy, and the story fades into the calm of night, let your mind drift not to the noise of war, but to the streets of Damascus at dusk, to the wind brushing over the desert hills, to the soft rhythm of prayers carried by the breeze. This was the world of Saladin. Not a world of chaos, but one of purpose. Not a world of rage, but of meaning. A world where history was made, not by force alone, but by principle. Sleep gently now. Let these echoes of the past settle quietly in your thoughts. You've walked through centuries tonight. Through cities lost to time. Through lives remembered in silence. Thank you for sharing this journey. May your dreams be peaceful. And your rest as calm as the legend of Saladin himself.